Hello, today I'm going to be reviewing Lian's brand new O11 Mini, and I've already done a full step-by-step build guide for the case and as well a thermal testing video where I reveal the best thermal configuration for this case. So if you haven't seen either of those two videos, you'll find links to them in the description. So the O11 Mini comes in two different colours, black and white. The black version has an MSRP of $99.99. Whereas the white version, which I have here, will cost you an extra $10 at $109.99. Okay, let's take a closer look at the case. Taking a look at the case's front I/O, we have two USB 3.0 Type A connectors, we've got a USB 3.1 Type C connector, we've got a combined headphone and microphone jack and a power button. Important to note, there is no reset button. The case's top panel is held on with two captive thumb screws at the back. Once these have been removed, the top panel can simply be slid backwards and lifted away. With the top panel removed, the tempered glass side panel can simply be lifted upwards and away. It is important to note that you can only remove the tempered glass side panel once the top panel has been removed. The case's front mesh panel is removed in exactly the same way, it just needs to be lifted upwards and then it can be lifted away. Taking a look at the back of the panel we have just removed, you'll notice there's no included dust filters behind it, and Lian are going with just mesh in this case. However, looking at the pattern of the mesh, the perforations in the mesh are quite small, and certainly smaller than in the O11 Dynamic Mini, which did include dust filters over the mesh panels. The other side panel can be removed by loosening two captive thumb screws at the back, and then simply sliding it backwards. And due to its different securing mechanism, you are going to be able to remove this panel with the top panel still installed. Taking a closer look at the panel we've just removed, you can see there's two large areas of perforation, but again, no dust filters included. The case's one and only dust filter is at the bottom, and it can simply be pulled out from the front. The case comes with three included case fans. We've got two 140mm fans pre-installed at the front and a 120mm fan at the rear. It's good to see the fans used have 4-pin PWM connectors and they are colour matched to the case. So if you get the black case, you're going to get black fans. If you get the white case, you're going to get white fans. The two 140mm fans at the front are secured in removable brackets. Each of the brackets is held on with two screws. With the screws removed, the brackets can simply be lifted upwards and away. Moving into the case's rear compartment, it's good to see we've got plenty of mounting points for SATA SSDs. Over to the left hand side, on each of the removable brackets, you can mount either a 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drive. On the removable cable bar in the middle, you can mount a further two 2.5-inch drives, while on the hard drive cage, you can mount a further two 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drives. Below the hard drive cage is where you're going to install your power supply, and it's great to see the case supports full-sized ATX power supplies up to 200mm in length. The removable cable bar in the middle is held on with a thumb screw at the top and a single screw at the bottom. With these loosened and removed, it can simply be lifted away. Again, it's good to see that Lian have included some Velcro straps to help with cable management. If you're planning on installing radiators or fans on the side of the case, you're going to need to remove the two brackets over to the left-hand side. They're each held on with a thumb screw. Once this has been loosened, the brackets can simply be lifted away. It's good to see we've got cutouts in all the right places, and the two large cutouts over to the right-hand side of the motherboard have rubber grommets on them. Moving to the rear of the case, you can see the hard drive cage has a cover on it which is held on with a thumb screw at the top. The two drive trays can simply be pulled out from the back. Taking a closer look at the hard drive cage, you'll notice it's secured to the case using rivets rather than screws, which is going to mean it's going to be a whole lot more difficult to fully remove the hard drive cage. There are a few downsides to this. One of the reasons you might want to remove the hard drive cage is it's going to mean you're going to have more space at the back of the case for cable management. Another potential problem this might cause is the hard drive cage is going to block your access to the rear of the motherboard. So at a later stage, if you decide you want to change your CPU killer, you're probably going to have to remove the motherboard to get access to the back plate, because the hard drive cage is going to block your access at the back of the case. Out of the box, the case comes with 7 horizontal PCI expansion slots. If you're familiar with the O11 Dynamic Mini, it won't come as a surprise that you can reconfigure the layout at the back of the case. By loosening the thumb screws and using the optional panel from the case accessory box, the case can be converted from 7-slot mode to 5-slot mode. One of the reasons you may want to do this is if you're planning on using the case with either a micro ATX or mini ATX motherboard, it's going to more centre your motherboard in the case and increase the space above the motherboard for mounting radiators and fans. It is important to note that it's only in the 7-slot mode that you're going to be able to fit a full-sized ATX or eATX motherboard. And again, if you want, you still can mount a micro ATX or mini ATX motherboard in the 7-slot mode, which is going to give you more room below the motherboard. Again, for those of you familiar with the O11 Dynamic Mini, you'll spot another difference, and that is there's no option for a 3-slot mode. If you're planning to mount your graphics card in a vertical orientation, you'll be pleased to hear the case is compatible with Lian's vertical GPU panel, which is currently available in both Gen 3 and Gen 4 options, and also in black and white colour wise. So depending on what hardware you have and what case you go with, you should be able to get a good fit. In terms of graphics card support, the case will accommodate GPUs up to a maximum length of 362mm. You might be surprised by the case's fan support given its size, but it will actually accommodate up to a maximum of 10 case fans. At both the front and the bottom, the case will accommodate either 240 or 220mm fans. At the rear of the case, it's a single 120mm fan. At the top of the case, it's either 3 120 or 2 140mm fans, while on the side of the case you can fit up to 2 120mm fans. Taking a look at the case's radiator support, at the top, the bottom and the front, you're going to be able to either fit a 240 or 280mm radiator, while on the side of the case you're limited to a 240mm radiator. It is important to remember that radiator compatibility is going to be affected by whether you have the case in the 5 or 7 slot mode and the size of motherboard that you have installed. So for example, with a full-sized ATX motherboard in the 7 slot mode, you've only got 25mm of space above the motherboard, so you're only going to be able to fit fans and not a radiator in that particular mode. During the case review, I got to test out one of Lian's optional accessories, which was a radiator offset bracket. So it can be used in this case or the original O11 Dynamic Mini, and what it does, it lets you mount a top radiator with a full-size ATX motherboard in the 7-slot mode. So how it works, you fix these brackets to your radiator, and what they do is they move your radiator further forward, so it's away from anything that's going to catch on the motherboard. And in this particular case, it will let you fit a 240mm radiator at the top, or in the original O11 Dynamic Mini, a 360mm radiator at the top. If you do want to go with a push-pull configuration, this can be done both at the front and at the side. At the front again, you're just going to have to be careful with your GPU length, while at the side, the radiator needs to go in the main body of the case, but there is space for a set of fans behind the radiator in the rear compartment. If you're thinking of going down the air-cooled route, you'll be pleased to hear the maximum height of CPU cooler support is 170mm, so you should be able to fit a premium CPU cooler in this case. Okay, so let's take a look at the build I put together in the case. Moving on to take a look at the temperatures and the noise, but before we do, it's important to say that I had an i5 11500 being cooled by a 240mm AIO on the side set to exhaust. And for the GPU, we had an RTX 3080, and I maxed out all the case fan locations. So as you can see, the temperatures were very acceptable, with our CPU idling at 31 degrees and reaching a maximum 91 during the 10-minute ARES64 stability test. The GPU temperatures were equally good, 30 at idle, reaching a maximum of 70 during the ARES64 stability test. In terms of noise levels, these were equally impressive, with only 33 decibels of average noise at idle and 44 during the ARES64 stability test. So very impressive results in terms of temperatures and noise. Remember, however, that I have tested out a whole variety of different configurations in terms of radiator placement, fan placement, and even air cooling. And I actually have found a better configuration than the one I used in my build video. So make sure you check out my thermal testing video to find out what is the best thermal configuration for this case. So this brings me on to any issues I had during the build, and if I was building again, would I do anything differently? And in fact, this was an incredibly easy case to build in, and it would be perfect for a beginner. There was only one slight issue I did have, and that relates to the front removable fan brackets. And that is, it's important to remember that once you've installed fans at the top, you're going to not be able to either remove the brackets or reinsert them. So what I would recommend doing is doing everything you need to do with the front fan brackets before installing your top fans. And if you remember that, you shouldn't have any problems building in this case. So this brings me on to the things I like about the case, and I've already covered all the case's main features, so I just don't want to repeat myself and list them all again. But the things I liked about the case, I think it's a great looking case. It has excellent build quality, as you would expect from Lian. It has good airflow and gives good temperatures and good noise levels. And importantly, it comes with 3 included case fans. So although I did swap the fans out for the build, if you wanted to save yourself money, you don't need to do that. So this brings me on to some of the things I didn't like about the case. And while there's a whole lot I like about it, there was a few small features that I did find a little bit irritating and felt that could be improved upon. The first was the hard drive LED light round the power button. So around the power button, the power LED is a very attractive blue light, but whenever there is hard drive activity, you get a red flashing light around it, and I didn't like this visually. I think it's a bigger problem because the case isn't actually that tall, so when you're sitting at the desk, you can see the light, and it flashing away I found quite distractive. So again, I think if I was building in the case again, I would just leave the hard drive indicator LED wires from the front panel unplugged, and you would have the nice attractive blue light and no flashing red light. The second thing that I think could be improved upon would be to have the option to remove the hard drive cage. In terms of cable management, I didn't have any issues with managing the cables at the back of the case, and I did use cable extensions. In fact, the hard drive cage was actually quite useful to keep the cables installed in and out of the way. Where it was a slight problem was whenever I came to change from an AIO to an air cooler, and because the hard drive cage wasn't removable, I had no access to the back of the motherboard. The only way I could change the back plate on the motherboard was actually to take the motherboard out of the case, and this was quite frustrating. So while you mightn't want to do it for cable management, it is nice to have the option to remove it to access the back of the motherboard. Another thing I maybe wasn't so keen on was the decision not to include removable dust filters over the mesh panels at the front, the top and the side. I'm somebody who likes to decide whether I leave the dust filters on or take them off, and in general taking them off over a mesh panel will maybe save you 1 degree in your temperatures at best. To Lian's credit, they have changed the pattern to the mesh so it's definitely finer, and maybe you don't need a dust filter. But only time will tell whether the case ends up with dust or not. But again, I would much prefer to having the choice of whether to leave them on or take them off. Another slight negative for me was that depending on the angle you were looking at, the front fans and the brackets that they were mounted in slightly blocked your views of the fans at the side. Although I don't see any way around it. If you're going to have front mounted fans in the case and still keep the length of the case down, there's no way around it. But I thought it was something that I should point out. The final thing that I wasn't so keen on was some of the limitations that Lian have made with this case compared to the original O11 Dynamic Mini. and I want to finish by comparing the pros and cons of both the cases. So in terms of size, the O11 Mini is a little bit shorter in terms of length, but is a little bit wider than the O11 Dynamic Mini, and that brings some advantages and disadvantages. So starting off with the pros of the O11 Mini, and the clue to the first advantage is in the name Air. We've got a perforated panel on the front of this case compared to a glass panel on the front of the O11 Dynamic Mini. So this case should give you better airflow than the O11 Dynamic Mini. We've also got 2 extra fan mounting locations on the front of the case. The O11 Mini should have 2 cost-saving advantages over the O11 Dynamic Mini. The first is that it comes with 3 included case fans, whereas the O11 Dynamic Mini comes without any fans. The second is due to its extra width. You're going to be able to fit a full-sized ATX power supply in the Air Mini, whereas you're going to have to use an SFX or SFXL power supply in the O11 Dynamic Mini, which are harder to get and much more expensive. The final advantage of this case, and I think it's really an advantage or a disadvantage depending on how you're planning to build on it, and that is that there's no optional motherboard extension bracket required for this particular case. So if you're going to go with a full-size ATX or eATX motherboard, it should look better. Whereas I think if you're going with a mini ITX motherboard, you're going to have that extra space over to the right-hand side of the motherboard, and it might be a disadvantage. This brings us on to some of the disadvantages of the O11 Mini. I think really these can be summarised in terms of aesthetics and hardware support. So I think for me, I much prefer the look of the O11 Dynamic Mini. I love being able to look in at the front and see my build, and as well when I'm looking in at the side of the case, the fans at the front slightly obstruct the view of the fans on the side for me and detract slightly from the aesthetics. The other big difference between the two cases is in the radiator and fan support, and the reason for this is the O11 Mini is shorter than the O11 Dynamic Mini. So this means at the bottom of the Air Mini, you're limited to a 280mm radiator or 2 140mm fans, while in the O11 Dynamic Mini, you can actually fit a 360mm radiator or 3 120mm fans. Again, support on the side is also limited. In the O11 Dynamic Mini, you can fit 2 140mm fans or a 280mm radiator, whereas in the O11 Mini, you're limited to 2 120mm fans or a 240mm radiator. It is important to say in terms of airflow, the O11 Mini, you've got the additional airflow in from the front, which you don't have in the Dynamic. So I think those are the two major downsides to this case compared to the O11 Dynamic Mini, but there are 4 smaller disadvantages. The first is you're not going to be able to remove the hard drive cage in this case. The only dust filter you're going to get in this case is at the bottom. When you're reconfiguring the rear panel in this case, you've only got 7 and 5 slot mode, where in the O11 Dynamic Mini, you've got 7, 5 and 3. And the final disadvantage is that this case doesn't come with any hardware for mounting pumps and reservoirs, although I think that makes perfect sense because if you're going to go for a custom loop, you're going to go with the O11 Dynamic Mini. So now we've reached the point in the review where I need to tell you, should you go out and get this case? And it's a bit of a tricky one because I think Lian Li have actually beat themselves, and in my personal opinion, I would go with the O11 Dynamic Mini rather than the O11 Mini for the reasons we have outlined. And I think that depends mostly on what you're looking from with a case. And for me, aesthetics rate very highly, and that's the reason I would go with the O11 Dynamic Mini over the O11 Mini. I think if you're somebody who rates airflow and noise above aesthetics, then this would be the better case for you. Again, if budget's very important to you, the fact that this case comes with 3 included case fans and you're also going to be able to use a full-sized ATX power supply would point you to go to this case rather than the O11 Dynamic Mini. So I think really it depends what is most important to you. If this case has a lot of the features you're looking for, I can definitely recommend it. It is a good case, but just for me, the O11 Dynamic Mini would be my preference. So hopefully you found the review useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.